Everybody, man, I got to tell you, I'm excited to have the guy on the channel today. Oh my God, he and I have been talking. Let me tell you something, my friends, he can't hear me. I've been courting this guy for months because he's a professor and he's busy, he's, doing research and teaching and lecturing all over the country. And he said, I get back with you. And he is back with me today. Strong Inspirations. We will beg people to come on the channel because we want you to hear this information. Not that I had to beg him because he really wanted to do it. He was like, hey, I really want to do this. I got a bunch of things I can share. And he kept asking me, what do you want me to talk about? What have you. And then I looked over his resume and his writings, and we came up with something that I think you're really going to like, my friends. I'm Anthony Brogdon, as you know by now, and I'm the guy who hosts this channel. Happy New Year to you, my viewers. And this is going to, the video is going to go throughout the year, but when we're doing this, it's the first of 2022. I had a great year last year. I hope you all did too. We're over 250 videos, over 700 and some odd subscribers, and things are really moving. The train has left the station. I want you to hit the subscribe button. It's free. Don't ask no information. Let's keep that growing. Hit the notifications bell for when the new videos come up. You get a ding or something to let you know, hey, there's another video on Strong Inspirations. And I don't stop putting new ones up because I don't stop interviewing good people like my guest, right? And then tell somebody about Strong Inspirations. Don't keep it to yourself. I want you to come down to my festival that I'm having in Kansas City, Kansas, May 27th through the 29th. It's called Freedom Quindaro. I can only take 1,000 of you all. We're going to have big fun. I want you to come down and join me. I want to meet you, and I'm going to entertain you with the guests that are performing at the picnic on Saturday and the fish fry on Friday and a barn. Watch my movie, everybody, businessintheblack.net. Well, the name of the movie is Business in the Black. The website is businessintheblack.net, and it's streaming on Amazon. And I want you to, if you will, because I'm this serious, I wrote this book. I'm good at this thing, and it's very easy to read. It's called Black Business Book. Get your copy. Last year, I donated close to 400 books to schools. Just arbitrarily picked a school out and just sent them a book, because every 10th book I sell, I donate one to a school. So I think I donated close to about 120 books last year. It was good, and things is picking up. So get you a copy of this, Slaves That Went to College and Black Millionaires in the 1800s. Now you hear me use this word strong a lot, and I'm going to continue to use it because it's my favorite word. Strong stands for strength, tenacity, resilience, and a sense of oneness, nobility, and grace. And that is my introduction to my guest today, because he's a strong man. Watch out. You're going to like what he got to say. Come on, introduce yourself. Let's get it on. Thank you for being on the channel.
Well, great to be here. Looking forward to our chat. My name's Edward T. O'Donnell, or just Ed O'Donnell. And let's see, what do? I'm a historian and a college professor at Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. If you're old-time basketball fans, that's where Bob Cousy went to college and won a national championship, among other folks.
Yeah.
It's also where Dr. Anthony Fauci graduated from college as well. So.
Oh, really? Okay.
Also Clarence Thomas, also Michael Harrington, the famous socialist. So there's a long list, like any college. There's a list of alumni.
But I got, no disrespect on it, and I got to talk about you just for a second. I want my guests to know who my viewers to know who the guests are. Well, where are you from?
I'm actually from Massachusetts. So my college is in central Massachusetts. I'm from eastern Massachusetts, just north of Boston.
Now, how did you decide that you wanted to do history as a career choice and to teach?
Well, when you you head off into the world and have ideas. So my idea was I was going to be a doctor like my dad and my brother. I also have a sister who's a nurse. So I was all set to become, the next in line to become a doctor. And then I took chemistry and got kind of crushed. So I knew that I loved history. My family, my dad was actually a history major who became a doctor. My brother was a history major who became a doctor. So a lot of history in my household growing up. And I also knew I'd like to teach. So it was a painful process, transition, like any, big getting knocked down, any crash and burn moment. It's hard, but I picked myself up and, switched over to history, and pretty early on in that process realized I really wanted to teach at the college level. And
now, is there a particular history that is of your focus other than what we're going to talk about today?
Well, yeah, I mean, like everything in the world today, everybody's specialized. So, so my field is U.S. history, and really concentrating on roughly the Gilded Age, Progressive Era, so 1870 to 1920. But I do teach courses that cover sort of all of American history as well. But that's really where all my research, all my writing, the topic we're going to talk about today is set in the early 20th century.
When we talk about history, and understandably, our channel is more focused on Black history, but Black history is so intertwined with American history in general. Yep. Even though we were such a small number of the population, we played a big role in this. Is that kind of how you see it as you look at history and throughout all that you teach and specialize in?
Absolutely. I mean, it is one of those amazing, one thing that historians often will say is everything and everybody has a history, right? So, right. And there's, one of the great African-American history archives in America is located in Harlem, which we'll be talking about today at 135th Street, the Schomburg Center. And Arturo Schomburg was a man of African and Puerto Rican ancestry. And when he was a young kid, he became really interested in Black history. And I think he asked his 5th grade teacher if he could do his history report on something in Black history. And the teacher said, well, there is no Black history. And that sort of never left his mind. And that as he grew up, that motivated him. And he became a private, I can't even remember what his regular job was, but his passion was just to get his hands on and to purchase and to collect as much Black history as possible. And then eventually he sold the collection to the New York Public Library. But that idea that a very significant, in fact, the entire continent of Africa, also, roughly 10 to 20%, depending on what time you're talking about, of the American population has no history, is really, deeply rooted in, obviously, in racism and in an ability to kind of erase people's importance and their contribution. And ever since the early 20th century, in fact, it goes back even before that, but certainly in the early 20th century, people like Schomburg and, Carter Woodson and others, the guy who invented Black History Month, they began to sort of really make that point of saying, we've always been here. We've always made incredible, vital contributions, whether it's, the American Revolution or, the invention of various, key parts of our Industrial Revolution, or to, politics, also to changing the definition of American citizenship. We have the 14th Amendment which, it's kind of hard to imagine. We had over 100 years of American history before we actually defined what a citizen was and what the rights of a citizen were. And that's entirely due to the work of African Americans, for half a century before that, demanding they be considered citizens and demanding that once everybody is free, that they also become citizens.
Well, okay, well, on that same note, when we talk about Black history, there might be 2 angles that the majority of people don't want to talk about or to highlight or to even say happened in history. One is the angle of the brutality of what happened to African Americans. The other is the good things that we were able to accomplish. That's pretty much the lines that we work with under when we talk about particularly Black history. Would you say?
I would. I say that one of the reasons why people don't want to talk about slavery and then the legacy of violence, long after slavery and exclusion and taking people's land and so forth, is that it's a really ugly history. And so this is the debate, the national debate that we're talking about. And just like in a family, you might not want to talk about the domestic violence that has taken place in the family, or the infidelity or the bankruptcies and all of that stuff. But if you, the thing I always say is Americans want a photo album history. They want, if you look at it, if you walked into any regular middle-class family's house and pulled out a photo album and leaf through it, all you'd see is birthdays and baptisms and weddings and family vacations and just awesome, Christmas, lots of lovely, joyful things. That will tell you a little bit about that family, but not a whole heck of a lot, right? Because the messy stuff is never in you don't put divorce in your photo album. You don't put domestic violence in your photo album. You don't put bankruptcy, infidelity, mental illness. None of that makes its way into the family photo album. So, Americans are uncomfortable with confronting that ugly history and want to tell themselves that was way, way, way back in the past. And it's, we should quote unquote, move on. And I think that's a very tempting thing.
What is your take on having this history be told, though? You teach it. So when you teach Black history and you have students, what do you hope people get out of this? Understanding some of these good and bad stories.
Well, we want a lot to happen in history class, but one is to not kid ourselves. There's a great line by Abraham Lincoln. I can't remember which one of his famous speeches, but he says, "Fellow citizens, we must disenthrall ourselves." Right? We need to just stop being like kidding ourselves about how perfect we are, and face up to the facts of who we are and where we are and what we've done. And I think that's the most important thing. Many of my students always say, I'd studied, slavery in 4th grade and 8th grade and 11th grade. And, I thought I kind of knew the story of slavery. And they're kind of blown away in a 4-week unit that I do on Frederick Douglass and abolition, just to sort of really fully understand what, that slavery was not this fringe institution in a corner of the United States for a very short period of time that eventually, hooray for us, we got rid of. It was, this foundational institution that was really the bedrock of the American economy, and something that only disappeared because of a war. It could have lasted generations more had it not been for the Civil War. So I think kind of understanding what slavery actually was and what it meant for the economy, what it meant for America's rise to industrial power, and also what it meant for others. That. Not only is it a story of Black history, it's a story of Native American history, because, the reason that President Jackson forces all those Southern Native American tribes to go west on the Trail of Tears is that he knows that that's the best cotton land in the world, and to open up that land for white migration and the spread of slavery. So, even a chapter of history that we think of as sort of a Native American history chapter is actually a slavery cotton American chapter.
Now, as you alluded to earlier, and I like what you just said. I knew the Trail of Tears, and I've had Seminole Indian descendants on the channel, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But I now understand the beginning of it and the logic behind it, which leads to what we were going to talk about, the Harlem Renaissance. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about, well, first of all, why you chose that as something to study and to talk about, not just now, but as you have in the past.
Yeah, well, my background is that I told you I came from Massachusetts, but I went to graduate school in New York City. Okay. And so that kind of threw me into New York, and almost immediately I fell in love with New York City history. I started to put myself through grad school, I started a walking tour business, taking people on historic neighborhoods, including Harlem, Wall Street, Greenwich Village, Central Park, the Lower East Side, just it's a city incredibly rich in history. And also to help pay some bills, because before long I had 4 little kids under the age of 5, to do a lot of writing. So I just would look for these great kind of vignette stories that kind of told a bigger story about New York. And the story of Philip Payton, this amazing kind of forgotten figure, is one of those stories that just stands out. And so I remember including it in my classes that I taught, but then also eventually writing it up for the New York Times. They had a kind of a regular Sunday history feature for a while.
And so tell us about him. Who was Philip Payton and so on and so forth?
Yeah, well, we should back up and just, historians always want to give a little context. So Harlem is the most famous Black neighborhood in the world, but it was originally intended, starting in the 1880s and 1890s, as part of New York City's expansion. That was going to be the next really kind of luxury white suburb. And it was built up that way, and it was advertised as this kind of ideal place But at that point, there had elevated train lines that ran all the way up the north of Manhattan. And in the 1890s, they decided to build the subway system, which was going to run right up through Harlem. So, train stops boost real estate. So there's a huge boom in building in what becomes Harlem, all along 125th Street, 120, up to 140th Street, 145th Street, just dozens and dozens of these high-rise, 6, 7, 8, 10-story buildings,
Okay.
all intended for kind of upscale, upper middle class white families. But, real estate is subject to bust and boom. And so in the early 20th century, there was a kind of a fairly severe recession in the economy. And a lot of those buildings ended up, sitting empty. Real estate people were panicking. And along comes a guy named Philip Payton, who had just then started to get into real estate. He's an African-American man from Massachusetts. And he sees that there's, a growing Black population in the city. They mostly live in a really pretty rundown area of the middle west side, sort of an area called San Juan Hill in the West 40s, West 50s, West 60s, in a neighborhood with lots of poor whites, lots of violence, lots of, it's not a very good place to live. And so Payton has this vision that if he can kind of crowbar his way into Harlem and open up building by building, almost apartment by apartment, building by building, block by block, he can kind of create this kind of ideal African-American Mecca, or at least a decent neighborhood with new buildings, with new plumbing, with all of that. And so that's essentially what he did. He took, first, he didn't have any money, so he began to use or offer his services as a manager. So he would go to a person who owned a building and say, "I'll manage your building for you." And he began to specialize in buildings that housed African-American tenants. And that allowed him to kind of learn the business a little bit. He also, prior to that, had actually worked as a custodian in a real estate office, which is where, while he's emptying the trash cans, he's listening to what this thing is called real estate and how you do it.
I love it.
And he had a college education, so he's a very smart guy, looking for opportunity. And so he got into real estate in 1899, offering his services as a manager. Did reason, really struggled, wanted to give, thought about giving up many, many times, but kept going. He got married and his wife earned income, so that kind of kept them afloat for a while. But he kept getting more and more contracts to be the manager of these buildings, and then eventually.
Let me back up here. I don't mean no disrespect. How did it become the name Harlem? Where does that start from first?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. That's a Dutch name. So there's a place in the Netherlands called Harlem, and the original, the original European colonists that kind of began settling New York, which they called New Amsterdam, were the Dutch. So there's a lot of places like Brooklyn there's a place in the Netherlands called Brooklyn. So there's a lot of place names in New York that have that old Dutch connection.
Okay,
yeah,
I
so
got you.
Harlem has a name that goes back to the 1600s.
Okay.
And so so Payton eventually starts buying a few buildings and begins to achieve some success, make some money. And this is, the timing is interesting. This is all around 1902, 1903. So people aren't really talking about the Great Migration, but what becomes the Great Migration, the movement of millions of African Americans from the South to the North, that really starts happening after 1910. But Payton's kind of ahead of the game. He can see that there's the population is rising and that there's opportunity there. And for him, it's a win-win. He says, I'm in the business of making money, but I'm also a civil rights activist. I'm also a person who believes in justice and in racial equality. And he even says, racism is a luxury. And if we can make, like in New York, anything that's a luxury is really expensive. So he's in his advertisements, he says to his fellow African Americans, we can make this luxury really, really expensive, if on these white landowners who won't rent us properties, or will only rent us properties at sky high prices. And so he, building by building, and he begins to convert, apartments and buildings into predominantly for African American tenants. And you can imagine the white real estate interests and the people that own the buildings and tenants. The resistance was fierce.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Yeah. How did that go? First of all, how did he talk them into saying okay when they didn't want to live with African Americans and what have you? Was there a flight of them leaving when they began to see it taking place, so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, this is an early version of what we call in the mid 20th century white flight. So that so that's a phrase that, if you Google it, it probably says, first used in 1951 or something, and that's true of urban neighborhoods in every major American city, and suburbanization. But this is an early version of it, where whites see this neighborhood as rightfully theirs, and as African Americans as outsiders and illegitimate residents. But money talks, and so what happens is you've got white landowners, building owners, who have half their building is empty, and they don't want to rent to black tenants. But Peyton says, well, I can get you black tenants, and I can manage them for you, and you can make money, or you can go out of business, and then I'll buy your building. So he's very, money talks, and he says, let's make a deal. And and the same thing that happened, in the neighborhoods in Chicago and in Detroit and in Boston, where it just takes a tipping point, essentially. And so once one building is rumored to be going all black, and then does go all black, it causes a panic among white residents, triggering their latent racism, and so they up and leave. And so Peyton is a kind of a key figure in kind of pushing that population until it tips. And so he goes, it's interesting. He makes a lot of money, but real estate is very sketchy in terms of, it's not very easy, boom and bust. And he goes out of business. His Afro-American Realty company goes out of business in 1908. So just after,
was that the name of the company?
Yeah, he founded it in 1904 as the Afro-American Realty Company, and explicitly said in his announcement, this is about racial justice and equality, and making money, because he was looking for investors as well as looking for tenants. So he goes out of business. He gets back into the business, but by 1908, the tide is turning, and so institutions, it's not just people, it's institutions. So all the black churches along the west side of Manhattan, in that that Hell's Kitchen, San Juan Hill neighborhood. If you go see the new West Side Story, or the old West Side Story movie, it's set in that really rough neighborhood. And in fact, in 1900, so a little more context, it's not just that it's a rundown neighborhood, it's a neighborhood that is, very, very hostile to black residents. And so in the summer of 1900, an incident involving a black man and a policeman, surprise, surprise, triggers a whole week of incredible violence by white residents of that lower, that middle West Side neighborhood against black residents. And so that's also in Peyton's mind, which is like, wherever we live, we're in this city, we are subject to explosions of violence, and death. And so we want to move to a better place. And so by 1908, even though he's kind of faltering economically, the population is growing. In 1910, Philip, I'm going to get the name wrong, St. Philip's Episcopal Church, a very, pivotal black church on the west in New York, moves up to Harlem. In 1913, the Harlem, a YMCA, an African-American YMCA on the west side, moves up to Harlem. And so one by one, AME Zion Church moves up there. And so, and then, also then, famous people move there, like Madam C.J. Walker and others. And then the table is set for the 20s, when we have this thing called the Harlem Renaissance. But in many ways, it begins with, a visionary man who we've kind of forgotten, unfortunately, named Philip Peyton.
Does he face in the early days of his business, is he a one-man band, or does he eventually, hire people to work for him? I'm sure he can't do it all. So yeah, does he, does the company grow before he goes under and then comes back? How does that look for him?
Yeah, his brother worked with him for a while. And then he, as I understand it, he had, because he eventually had quite a number of buildings under his control, that he hired other African-American building managers as part of that kind of plan. But the fact, and he also, he was looking to go public, as we'd say today. So when he opened the company, he was always looking for shareholders, and that's always risky. You sell shares to people and they all expect dividends, and then, real estate market goes up and down. And anyway, and it doesn't take much. It's no knock on him that he went out of business, because he also goes back into business and continues to sell buildings until he dies. He actually dies, at age 41 in 1917. So it's a short but meaningful and impactful life.
Do people know him in New York? Have they heard of him
I
and
don't
what
know.
he's done?
Part of what I wanted to do when I wrote that article for the Times was to sort of, tell that story. And every now and again, I haven't lived in New York for 20 years, so I don't know, but I would be shocked if there's not some kind of sign or some kind of, Philip Payton Square, or something like that that the city has put in place. There's another famous story. I don't know if do you know the story of Elizabeth Jennings?
No, let's do that.
All right, so this is one of these great stories, and so in 1854, so 101 years before Rosa Parks, Elizabeth Jennings, a young African-American woman, daughter of a prominent Black minister, stepped onto a streetcar in New York and was told, get off, I don't allow, that was really the conductor who was saying, you are not permitted to even ride in the back of my vehicle. Anyway, she resists, she gets arrested, and she hires an attorney named Chester A. Arthur, who, you can't make this up, future president of the United States. And they argue the case against this, segregation exclusion law or practice in New York, and she wins. And so, it's a really fascinating early civil rights victory, but 101 years before Rosa Parks, and that's another, like one of those things. What do you want students to understand about history? It's that civil rights didn't start in 1954 or 1951 or 59 or there's never been a moment where people who are excluded and who are oppressed and people who are marginalized and exploited haven't been fighting back and pushing back and resisting. There's a historian friend of mine used to tell, he's the guy who sort of put this in my head. He said he would always begin his class by saying, hey, when did the civil rights movement begin? And kids would offer all kinds of answers. They'd say 1947, Jackie Robinson, or 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. And he would take a lot of these answers, and then in the end he'd say all good answers and all wrong. The answer is 1619. This is decades before 1619 became a thing. He'd say that's when it began. The moment an enslaved person arrived in America, they began to resist and push back against the institution. So Elizabeth Jennings, this is how I'm going to close this circle. For years, I was saying there's got to be why does New York City not know about her? Why don't we have a street named after her? And lo and behold, there is I don't know if it's a street, but it's definitely Elizabeth Jennings Corner has a nice prominent sign on the signpost right near where she was thrown off of that streetcar in 1954. So I'm guessing Philip Payton may have, maybe in that same category of lesser known people that are getting a little bit of due.
Do you know of a story of him having death threats or anything like that? Was that a problem for him?
He didn't, as far as I know, no death threats, but it was really more of a financial threat. So that white building owners and neighbors in Harlem organized, they signed covenants. Again, this is just like the 1940s and 1950s, 1960s. They signed, they created block associations. They tried to create legal frameworks very explicitly to keep, they weren't kidding around. They said they want to keep Harlem white and, white tenants association and so forth. So he faced mostly legal and financial pressure, as far as I know. And he may have also faced death threats, but chose not to mention them.
Yeah. Well, let's go to another story since we're on the Harlem, and maybe you know this one, maybe you don't. But Central Park was once a neighborhood for African Americans. Do you know that?
Sure. I mean, I'm doing
let's go
memory,
into that one too.
Yeah. So, all right, in the Central Park is an idea for a long, long time, but it really takes root in the 1850s. Several prominent New Yorkers say, look, if we want to be a world-class city, London has its amazing parks, Paris has its amazing parks, and we've got nothing. So let's, in some ways, let's do the unthinkable in the most capitalist city in America. Let's take a ton of real estate out of circulation, right in the middle of the city, over 800 acres, and erase those street lines, because it was all mapped out to be streets, and turn it into a park. And eventually it becomes this, legendary, amazing jewel in the middle of the city. But, there's just like the American West, when people went west and said, let's just take the land and all, disregarding people living there, the Native Americans. Same thing is happening by the 1850s. There are, I think, around 1,000 people, mostly Irish and mostly African American, living in what was then nicknamed, it wasn't an official name, Seneca Village. And actually nobody really knows where the name Seneca Village came from.
Okay.
But by 1855, just before they're all forcibly evicted, there are schools, there are churches, there are homes. And, the historical record often referred to all these people as squatters. They were just sort of, it was like a homeless community. Historians eventually going into it looked and said, absolutely not. There probably were a few squatters, but this is a full-blown community living in well-built homes. There's cemeteries, there's churches, there's schools, so there's been a fascinating effort over the last 30 years to kind of reconstruct like what Seneca Village actually was, who the people were that lived there, and then what happened to them. I mean, in the short term, what happened is that they were all evicted, and they sued, and those who owned property got some compensation, but not very much. Okay. And that neighborhood just really was sort of obliterated to make way for Central Park. But they've done sound, the kind of like a real estate sonogram, I can't remember, it's radio sound waves and such. Sure. And they found the foundations, they found places where there were wells and all. So there's quite a bit of work, and the census has also been very helpful. And another thing, like, why did people start moving there in the 1820s, which is when it really starts showing up? New York State, like a lot of states in the North, began when voting started to be opened up to most people without property, white people without property. That also meant Black people without property. Free African Americans could vote. And so many northern states passed laws that curbed Black access to voting. So in New York, any white male citizen could vote, but any Black male citizen had to own X amount of property in order to vote. And so whereas let's say a barber or a boot or a small grocery store owner, African American in New York City, where they probably don't own much property at all, right, given the socioeconomic stand. But if they moved up to Seneca Village, they could buy a very cheap piece of property and therefore qualify as voters. So that's one of the speculations by some of the historians, is saying that's the incentive to move out of the more crowded, dirty, neighborhoods that have, lots of epidemics and things and violence, and move up to, outside the main city to this little village, essentially on the edge of the city. And it's also another good example of, almost everywhere that you find African Americans in the 19th century and into the 20th century, you also find an Irish population. That's true in almost any big city. And so they were coexisting, even though a lot of conflict ensues between those two groups. There's also a lot of cooperation, a lot of interchange, a lot of marriage, and in fact that's where tap dancing comes from in America. It's really? In a neighborhood, the neighborhood that many people left in New York to go up to Seneca Village, which is in the west. Well, in Central Park in the what is now the 60th, 69th, 70th Street area. They were leaving a rough neighborhood called 5 Points, which is way downtown, right by the City Hall, and the courthouses are located now. And 5 Points is in the centerpiece of that film. Not so great film, but people love it. The Gangs of New York. Okay. So they, a lot of people have left that neighborhood to go up to Seneca Village, but at the time it was a very heavily populated Irish and Black neighborhood, and that's the place where American tap dance originates. This kind of fusion of both African American and Irish music, and also African American and Irish dance steps. So there's a lot of fascinating hidden history just in those areas.
Let me go back to this just for my clarity. Seneca Village, was that in Central Park?
Yeah, what is Central Park today? Yep. So
now, what would you imagine if it's 800 acres, the park itself? How many acres might have Seneca Village been? It wasn't a whole park, I'm sure.
No, it was probably about, I would say, 10% of the park. Okay. But I'm not so good at sure. But I think Central Park is over 800 acres. I'm pretty sure. I think it's like 860 acres. It's actually larger than Monaco, so it's huge. Yeah. And so even if it's 10% of the park, that would be about 80 acres of land for 1,000 people. Yeah. So
and they have found the burial grounds, haven't they?
Yes, they've found the burial grounds. They've found, they've done periodically a little bit of excavation. The city is not so excited about having a huge, archaeological dig in the park, but they've allowed a little bit of work to be done, and it's pulled up all kinds of fascinating artifacts, including human remains in the cemetery. So it's I think people still have ambitions of doing something bigger down the road, of really literally digging into the ground.
When as we kind of come to a close, and going back on the Harlem note, the gentleman that you mentioned, he was he noted as a celebrity, a big shot? Did in his day that he's walking around and everybody kind of know him, or what was
Yeah.
your take on his personality in that regard?
Well, I don't know about his personality, but he definitely, when he's at the peak of his success, right, 1907, 1906, 1907, 1908, he is friends with, all the elite African Americans that are starting to move to Harlem. They all know him. In fact, many of them are relying on him to help them acquire property, to help them gain a foothold in the neighborhood. So he, whether he went to all the fancy parties and things,
Yeah,
I don't
sure,
really know, but he was definitely a household name. In that era and in that moment where people are seeing Harlem as, becoming this, not just a place to live, but it may be a place for a whole new way of living, and a whole, kind of a dynamic place where it's not just safe and clean and new, but also a place where people can interact, and there's space to educate your children and to discover new things and meet new people. I think he's definitely seen as kind of the catalyst behind that.
Sure.
He falls on hard times and then recovers. So I don't know. He's not a big diamond ring, fancy car driving person. I think if he had stayed successful, he probably, and lived longer, he probably would have achieved that kind of status.
I got maybe two more questions come to mind. Okay, so Harlem was built for the more wealthy people, let's say, as you
Yep.
said earlier. How were those African Americans able to afford those homes or the apartments or what have you? Did they lower the rates because of the economy, and that did it, or did they do such things as divide a nice home into various smaller homes? What do you think? How was that able to happen?
Yeah, I mean, they did all those things, and so
Okay.
they lowered rents to the point that where they could get people, but they also allowed people, to double up, either unofficially or officially. They did, like some of those apartments, some of those buildings were like 7-8 room apartments, and I mean, they're beautiful buildings. So they were really intended for like a lawyer and his family to live there. Those would easily be cut up into three room apartments, make them, small. And, and what happens is over time, because most of the owners of the property remain white landowners renting to, struggling, aspiring African Americans, they know that Harlem is kind of a marquee place to live. So they can actually charge more rent, which means more people will double up, have more people live, 9 people, 10 people living in an apartment instead of 4 or 5. And the landlords also are not really all that motivated to do much maintenance, to improve these apartments, because they, at some point they're looking maybe to, wring as much value out of it as possible, and then leave it behind. And so that's part of the long-term legacy, is that this vibrant, exciting neighborhood was also one that was expensive, one that where people, had to pay way too much out of their modest incomes to rent apartments, and where, there's just so many aspects of life in Harlem that were difficult. And then, as the infrastructure begins to crumble, it doesn't get repaired, and so it enters a bit of a downward spiral. And then you add to that, this is all the thing we talked about earlier, white flight, and sort of the booming suburbanization after World War II. Whites began to leave places like New York City and places like, and investors, and with redlining from insurance companies and things, and the US government, of course, it meant that those neighborhoods were kind of locked into that downward spiral of disinvestment, crumbling infrastructure, buildings. And I remember, I first started walking around Harlem in the late 1980s, and they were I don't know if entire blocks, but large sections of Harlem, they were just boarded up. They what are now like $10 million, $10 million brownstone buildings, or $25 million apartment buildings today, were basically foreclosed on. The roofs have caved in. The building, the windows were all bricked up or boarded up. Yes. It's hard to imagine. That was not that long ago, but that was all that legacy of disinvestment, of redlining, and all that really kind of accelerated the economic downward spiral of Harlem. unfortunately.
One more question was, as Harlem became the African-American community, were there other, and you might have said maybe Irish or others, that fought that and maintained their own culture within Harlem? Is there a pocket of Dutch or you name the nationality, other than African Americans that remained in Harlem even during those days when Harlem was at its height?
Yeah, I would say the major African American neighborhood in Harlem starts on the west side and then grows north and east across the whole top of Manhattan. And so at that time there's a big Irish community living in Harlem. There's also a very large Jewish community living in Harlem. And in fact, if you look really closely, you walk around Harlem and you see a big Baptist church. But if you look really closely down at the cornerstone, there's Hebrew writing and a 6-pointed Star of David, meaning it was originally like in 1905, it was a synagogue. And then, and you see a lot of that in New York.
Yes.
Religious sites getting kind of recycled into new religious sites.
Yes.
And so what happened was those Irish and Jewish populations, and there's also on the east side, an Italian population as well. They all gradually moved out as the Black population continued to rise, and that kind of dynamic that had started at the beginning just continued to play out.
And
so
then
by
last question,
1940,
I keep saying that, but when did Harlem begin to rename some of the streets under famous noted African Americans, Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, so on and so forth? When did all that kind of begin to take place?
That is a good question. I don't know the specific answer, but I would say it's almost certainly a 1970s initiative, because part of that broader civil rights, in the same way that civil rights in the 60s was about the Civil Rights Act and voting, but that's also when we see the explosion of Black history studies, Black Africana studies programs in colleges, Black pride and so forth. And so out of that comes the effort to reclaim Harlem in many ways and create Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard and all the other ones. So that I think that it's probably the 1970s, and it's continued. There are other areas, naming one of the boulevards for Frederick Douglass. That's more recent. So there's an ongoing effort to, and it's happening in Boston as well. Just neighborhoods that have these either names of people who nobody cares who they were, or people that were somehow involved in the slave trade or what have you. And they're reclaiming, there's a part in a predominantly Black part of Boston where they've renamed it Nubian Square. So it's an effort that's ongoing. People, in many ways it's symbolic, but it's also very meaningful.
Have you written a book, or how can people follow you to hear more of what you talk about? Do you have a website? Any of those kind of things?
Yeah. So you can my ubiquitous social media handle is In the Past Lane. So that's with a P, INTHEPASTLANE, sort of a play on the phrase in the fast lane. So In the Past Lane, you can find me on Twitter. You can also find me on Instagram, and I don't know, recently on TikTok. Which is something you should think about, because that's a great way to meet a lot of, to get the message out to a different demographic of folks, younger folks. But I also have a website, edwardtodonnell.com. So if you just Google my name, Edward T. O'Donnell, I pretty much come up, and I have a podcast that actually I'm not recording anymore, but there's some terrific episodes there, including quite interviews with lots of folks on African American history. Some Annette Gordon Reed, who's written about Jefferson and Sally Hemings. She's one of my most popular episodes. So quite a lot to tap into there.
Okay. Well, hey, I thank you so very much for coming on Strong Inspirations, and sharing this. I go to New York often, and at one point it was almost every month, maybe 2-3 times a month. And I love the city and the energy, and that Harlem areas where I kind of usually go and hang out. But I circulate through the other borough, in particular Brooklyn.
Yep.
Again, thank you so very much for coming on the channel. Everybody, this is what we do here, Strong Inspirations. Man, I'm telling you, I find these people, they experts. They know what they're talking about, and they somehow agree to come on the channel, and I let them do the talking. Everybody hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, hit the notifications bell, tell somebody about Strong Inspirations. And to you, I say this with all sincerity, and I mean this. I want you to stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind. I love what you're doing. I love you sharing this and giving and finding these unique stories. Please continue to do that. Everybody follow him, and we'll go from there. Thank you so very much. Bye-bye. We out.
Thank you.